Hello everybody and welcome along to this video. Mr. Johnson teaches how to begin comparing poems. This is a video that is going to be helpful for your GCSE English Literature, and we're talking Literature Paper 2, and in that exam in Section B, that is when you are asked to do as it says on the title here, and that is begin comparing poems. This video presumes that you are at a starting point with this. I'm going to put together another video which is actually more about how to write the poetry comparisons, but if you're really not sure where to begin and just would like to have a bit of revision going right back to basics, then this is going to be the video for you. You're going to need to be ready to pause this video and have some pen and paper ready so you can actively make notes, and that will be part of good revision. So let's move on into the video then. So let's take it right back to basics and think at the most simple level, what you are trying to do is find the similarities and the differences between two things. In this case, it's going to be poems, but in my example, the first example I'm going to use, we're going to very simply just look at exactly what comparing means. And for that, that's where this illustration will come in. So take two things. Looking at those two things and holding them up together as you would hold up poems together, when you look at them, there's some obvious similarities and there's obvious differences as well. And if we were to write about these two objects, we would be able to talk about how they're both similar and different. And the same is true of poems. Poems are both similar and they're also different. They are both poems, so therefore they're going to maybe use some of the same methods. They might be about the same things. However, how the writer wanted to show it, that might be where the differences come. So similarities and differences. So taking these fruits as an example, your apple on the left, your orange on the right. At a simple level, you could say both are fruits. I mean, both have got bright colours. They're skins. Other ones could have been they're both shiny, maybe as well. Yet they're also relatively smooth. They're roughly the same size. Yet moving your comparison forwards a little bit, you could also say the following things as well. There's one is this, the other is this. So one is green, one is orange. You normally peel the orange to eat it. You don't normally peel the apple to eat it. One's citrus, one isn't. One's tropical, one isn't. You can see then, when you look at the whole screen there together, that we've got similarities and differences going on here. And then again, if we were to move into write about them, then we'd be able to talk a bit about both, how they are both similar and different. And the same is exactly true of the poems. So don't feel afraid of them. You can talk about how they're similar and different, and that's going to be really, really important. So moving on then, it also depends on what you're asked to focus on. So if I was looking at the fruits and I was asked to talk about their appearance, that's very different to asking to talk about their taste, for example. So read the questions. How you compare is going to be depending on what you are asked to do. So for example, these are a couple of sorts of questions that you might expect to find on your literature exam. First one, comparing the ways that poets present soldiers' lives in Remains and one other poem from Power and Conflict. The second one saying, compare the ways that poets present the effects of war in Exposure and one other poem from Power and Conflict. Looking at those two together, it's why I've done it. You can see how the question structure should always be the same. We've had a few exams like this now released, and they do follow this same question pattern. When your first word is compare, it talks about the ways that poets present, and then it changes into whatever your question focus will be on. Top one is focusing on presenting how soldiers' lives, or presenting soldiers' lives. The second one being present the effects of war. And while there's some similarities between those two questions, there are also obvious differences. And again, you're asked to focus on one poem, so top one Remains, second one Exposure, and then it's up to you to make a choice as to which other poem do you think, in the case of the top one, another poem showing soldiers' lives. Now that instantly will stop you being able to choose certain poems like Tissue, certain poems like My Last Duchess. However, soldiers' lives, well, soldiers feature in Charge of the Light Brigade, soldiers feature in Exposure, soldiers also feature in Bayonet Charge. Bottom one, again talking through some of those, the effects of war and exposure. So that's a war question, there's your keyword, so it means that I can't talk about My Last Duchess or Extract from the Prelude or London. But what I could talk about maybe war, I've also got Remains, I've got Bayonet Charge, Charge of the Light Brigade. So that's how you start doing it in your head. You look at those, what's called the steer of the question, those keywords, and decide which ones leap out at you. Which ones are the ones that you've learnt and have revised do you feel most confident and feel would best answer that question? But let's unpick a question a little bit more then. I've already used the phrase trigger words today. It's a phrase I like to use to talk about a word that triggers you to do something. Just like on a gun, when you pull the trigger, something happens. In that case, a bullet fires. That trigger makes something happen. When it comes to exam questions, there are also trigger words. So when you look at that question in front of you, just take a second, let's read it through and decide which things do you think are the trigger words when it says, compare the ways that poets present soldiers' lives in Remains and one other poem from Power and Conflict. So, on my next click then, I'm going to reveal some of the trigger words that will appear in every exam question. So if you can do it on this question and do it on other questions, when your one comes up for real, you'll be able to do it. So there they are. Firstly, the red one, compare. Now that instantly wants me to bring two things together like we did at the very start of this video with the apple and the orange. So put them together, comparing two poems. The ways. Now that bit in blue. The ways is another word for the methods. And in fact, I think I'm giving this away here. So let's just go back to that red bit a second. So as we've said with compare, hold them together. Like those two fruits, that picture was very deliberately chosen. Hold the two poems together. Don't compare them like one and then the other. The strongest marks, the better marks will come if you're able to talk about them at the same time. The ways I was just starting to talk to you about, those are the methods. So what does the writer use? Could it be personification? Imagery? I always say to my classes, you can almost always guarantee that a poem will contain imagery. Just make sure you say what sort of imagery it is. And then analysing those methods. So we're then comparing how do the poets do what they do. Do they both use personification? Do they both use repetition? Or does one use repetition and one use enjambment, let's say? The green bit then. Poets present soldiers' lives. This is what I would call the steer of the question. It's the key words. It's what it wants you to look at the most simple level. So we're going to be writing all about soldiers' lives in both these poems. We're nearly there with unpicking that question. What is left to talk about is just a reminder that you need to make a choice. That the question names one of the poems, in this case it's Remains and the one on the screen, but then you need to pick another poem which you think also contains that green bit, soldiers' lives. And I talked about that a minute ago. So for example, you wouldn't be talking about checking out my history in this question because it has nothing to do with soldiers. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with a quick plan together. So what I've got there is Remains. The first thing I need to do is make my decision as to which poem I'm going to compare with Remains. Now I'm decided that I would like to go with Exposure because both of them are about soldiers' lives. Both of the soldiers are suffering, but they're set in very different time periods. That makes the poems quite different in the way they appear, and there's sort of different reasons that the soldiers are suffering in these two poems, which I'll look at in a second. So what would be really good right now is I haven't got the pause symbol, but if you are following along and you've got that pen and paper, now is a good time to pause the video and just jot down some thoughts as to what would you say quickly about Remains and what would you say about Exposure. Now you can pause it now, or if you would like a little bit of extra help, here comes some bullet points that I came up with Remains, and you can do the one for Exposure before I show you. So with Remains, what's it about? Quite literally, it's about PTSD, a soldier who is suffering when he's gone home. He can't escape from these memories of what he's experienced and what he's seen. In the poem, his mind is the enemy to him. His mind is the one that keeps bringing these horrible images back to him. Another thing that struck me when I think about that poem, I think there's lots of bloody images. In fact, there's lots of repetition to do with blood. He talks about his bloody life in my bloody hands. There's the blood shadow is mentioned at one point, as well as the bullets that rip right through him. There's also the repetition. The things which happen at the beginning of the poem also happen at the end. It's almost like he's stuck in that loop. So those are just 4 quick things that I wrote down about Remains, the main thing that I can think about. Have a pause of the video. What would you say about Exposure? Use those bullet points to guide you. So pause this video and I'll be back with you in just a second. Right, hopefully you've had a go at that. Here, some of the things that I came up with. So in this poem, Exposure, we've got soldiers trapped waiting. So they're waiting for an enemy attack. They're waiting to go over the top themselves and attack from the trenches. This is the First World War. But in this poem, rather than the mind being the enemy as it is in Remains, the soldiers, it's the weather that seems to be attacking them in this poem. The main methods that I could think of, I seem to remember there's a lot of sibilants, those S sounds coming through in this poem, and there's a lot of alliteration. There's lines talking about the flowing flocks that come feeling for our faces, so those F sounds, and there are other examples of alliteration in that poem as well. But also there is repetition. They keep repeating the line, but nothing happens, but nothing happens. So now, when I start looking at those two poems together, I can actually start making comparisons. There are things when I hold them together that make them similar, like the repetition, for example, yet there are also things when I hold them together which are different. How the mind is the enemy in one and the weather's the enemy in another. One uses lots of gory imagery and blood. Exposure doesn't do that. It in fact uses lots of sibilants and alliteration. So while these two poems are actually quite similar, in the sense both are about soldiers who are trapped in some way, actually the way they show these soldiers being trapped are quite different. And that is the point I want to get to when I'm doing my answer. I want to go, how are they similar, but also how are they different? This is a moment where you are going to want to pause. Here's another question for you, and I've used the same colour coding. Compare the ways that poets present the power of nature in Storm on the Island and one other poem from Power and Conflict. So I'm going to choose the next poem for you because I think this would be a good one to compare. Hopefully it's one you know. If you don't know it, you might have to choose your own for this quick activity. I've gone from Extract from the Prelude, when William Wordsworth steals a boat and then feels all the guilt like nature is watching him. So pause the video now if you feel confident enough to have a go without any guidance from me whatsoever and do some quick bullet points about the two poems. If not, I'm going to reveal it in a second now. Those are the first things I came up with on that poem. What is it about at a simple level? What is used, and then I've got some ideas of some methods going on there. And again, get ready to pause this video because I'm about to reveal what I would say on the poem on the right, but it will be really good for you to have a go independently before I reveal it. So pause this video now. And those are what I came up with there. Now those don't mean that those are the only things you could say about those poems, but look at them again. Once again, we've got two poems about nature in some way. So both of these poems are about nature, yet how nature is presented is similar in some ways in the case of it's something which can be quite a negative thing, but also the way they present it is different. Yes, both of those poems show nature using personification. However, one or both have no stanzas, whereas one uses dark imagery, another uses lots of words linked to war. So what I'm always trying to do when I'm doing these comparisons is I'm trying to bring them together with what they both have in common. What are they both doing? And the fact that you're answering one question and you're choosing another poem, you're saying that both of them show the power of nature. How they do it is slightly different. So to bring this video to a bit of a conclusion, first thing, read the question and unpick those key trigger words. Make sure you've got those, and I would always encourage you to actually write on your exam paper, you're absolutely allowed to do this, write down what those trigger words are asking you to do. That way, when you start writing your answer, you shouldn't forget that you need to write about the methods. You shouldn't forget that you need to keep comparing all the way through. Make sure, obviously, then you choose your second poem once you've gone through the question, deciding which one also would link to the things that you've been asked to look at. Then the quick plan, like we've done, 3 or 4 bullet points would be absolutely ideal on each of the two poems, and then what you can start doing is like the picture of the apple and the orange, you can start looking at those bullet points and saying, well, which bits are similar and which bits are different, and then when you start writing, you'll start to write about why they're different. And finally, it's a case of getting ready to begin writing, which is going to be my next video. I'm going to start drawing it to a conclusion there. Hopefully a link will pop up on your screen in a minute which shows you or allows you to click straight on to go for the next video. You might need a pause, but know that it's there. I'm putting together a video which explains to you how to actually start writing your comparisons. To get going though, if you're still at a stage where you want to practice this a little bit further, then on the right hand screen side of your screen there in the yellow box, compare the ways that poets present the effects of war in Charge of the Light Brigade and one other poem from Power and Conflict. Have a little go at that, choosing a poem and then doing the 4 bullet point-ish comparison of the two. And that is it from me, so I wish you the very best of luck when it comes to any exams that you have to sit, and thank you for watching this video. Good luck and goodbye.